Star Trek III is a bit of a redheaded stepchild, and the only one of the Star Trek films which is really dependent on the audience knowing the events in its predecessor in order to fully land dramatically. A number of contrivances are employed to shuffle Spock back onto this mortal coil, and some of them are, well, kinda dumb. And with that, here are 10 of the dumbest things from Star Trek III: The Search for Spock. Number 10. Genesis goes poof. Genesis is truly an anything Muppet. It does everything the story requires of it, no matter how absurd. Case in point, conveniently blowing itself to smithereens. Exploding of its own volition is just as dumb as the idea that SETI Alpha 6 blew itself into bits in the Wrath of Khan. The amount of energy required to exceed the gravitational binding energy of an Earth-mass planet and blow the body into pieces that fly apart is literally astronomical. We're talking 200 nonillion joules. That's 200 followed by 30 zeros. That's as much energy as the sun emits in an entire week. Anything the size of a person that can transform an entire nebula into a planet that can blow itself apart with that sort of stellar energy output sure as hell must have been useful for something. Number 9. Shields first, evasive second. Esteban. We're under attack. Stand by for evasive poof. Upon the appearance of the bird of prey, Captain Esteban doesn't call for evasive action, he says to stand by for it. Worse, he doesn't call for shields, ergo, the lucky shot blows him and his crew to pretty sparkles. Granted, the Grissom is a scout ship and not a starship like the Enterprise, but even a scout ship captain should know to raise shields first. Heck, on the original TV series, the shields tended to snap on automatically when danger was detected. Esteban is portrayed throughout as rather ineffectual, but to be fair, in the shooting script he actually did call for shields first. Esteban, red alert, raise shields. Saavik, Captain, what's happening? Esteban, we're under attack, stand by for evasive, stand by for... You can tell this dialogue was filmed because when Esteban says, "Oh my god," on spotting the Klingon ship, the bridge lighting is normal. But when they cut back to him replying to Saavik, the bridge is suddenly at red alert lighting as called for in the deleted dialogue. Honestly, the film edit just does him really dirty. Number 8. Missing Mama Marcus. This film effectively pretends that Carol Marcus and the rest of the Project Genesis team didn't exist. In the Wrath of Khan, it's clear that Genesis is Carol's baby, and David works with her, but in this film, she's literally erased from the picture when she's removed from the Genesis tapes and replaced with KIRK. She doesn't even make it into the film's opening flashback, where Spock's funeral service has been edited to remove both her and David's faces. All the dialogue about Genesis makes it sound like it's David's baby instead of his mother's. Listen, we get it. They didn't want to use the characters, so they didn't want to have Carol as a loose end in this picture, or confuse the 7 viewers who would watch this film without first seeing The Wrath of Khan. This makes things tidier, but how hard would it have been for them to throw a bone to the members of the audience who remember the previous installment by simply mentioning her name? Actually, in Harve Bennett's March 23rd, 1983 first draft of the screenplay, there are several references to Carol by Saavik and David, which make clear that she didn't know about David's use of protomatter. But no, they wanted David to be solely responsible in order to justify his sacrifice. And speaking of that, number 7, jumping to conclusions. Saavik, my lord, we're survivors of a doomed expedition. This planet will destroy itself in hours. The Genesis experiment is a failure. David, Genesis doesn't work. I can't believe they'd kill us for it. Both Saavik and David jump to some very unscientific conclusions here. Sure, David says he's used unstable protomatter in the Genesis matrix, but he clearly thought doing so might work, and the Genesis cave seemed stable. In fact, they both overlook what any real scientist would immediately suspect: the experiment was compromised. Remember, Genesis Stage 3 was designed to be used on a lifeless space body, a moon or other dead form. It sure as hell wasn't intended to go off inside of a starship containing things like antimatter, which happens to be within a nebula, nor was it intended to congeal a planet from such nebula. There were just too many variables to conclude it was categorically a failure. perhaps the only believable aspect of this entire thing is that the untenable politics of this made the Federation scrap the entire project, destroy all the research, and give Carol Marcus a nice fat pension to disappear into darkness. Number 6. Kirk is commended, not court-martialed? When the Enterprise arrives at Earth, Admiral Moreau tells Kirk and his crew they will be receiving Starfleet's highest commendation, and more importantly, extended shore leave. The crew, many of them green cadets who never expected to go into battle, probably deserve the praise and the rest. But Admiral Kirk? If he had simply followed Starfleet regulations, the Enterprise would have raised its shields before Khan first attacked, and likely avoided getting pummeled in the ensuing battle. The consequences of Kirk's needless flaunting of procedure led to the Enterprise being trashed, the theft of the Genesis device, the deaths of Spock, Peter Preston, and who knows how many other casualties aboard the Enterprise. And most importantly, Kirk's negligence allowed Khan to detonate the Genesis device inside the nebula, creating the galactic controversy that sets the events of Star Trek III into motion. Kirk couldn't even plead ignorance of the regulations. In Wrath of Khan, Saavik reminds him of General Order 12, with time to spare before Khan is in firing range, a reminder Kirk ignored at his own peril. It sounds like Kirk should have been first in line for a court-martial, not a commendation. Number 5. Tractor beam? Nay. So, just how did the Enterprise get away? Does the space garage not have a tractor beam, or does it rely entirely on the tug shuttles seen cruising around inside its cavernous guts? Okay, put your pitchforks away. Maybe it does have a tractor beam, and maybe Scotty disabled it and has been monkeying around trying to get the space doors open. But nothing in the script or the finished film suggests this. As such, we're just left assuming that it doesn't have one at all. Even accepting this, what about the Excelsior? The Enterprise is still backing towards the space doors, which are closed, as Captain Styles enters the Excelsior bridge. So, instead of ordering 1/4 impulse power, why didn't he just order tractor beams right then and there, instead of waiting until Enterprise was outside the garage doors? Additionally, why would Excelsior have orders to pursue if Starfleet didn't think the Enterprise could get through the space doors in the first place? None of it really makes sense. Number 4. Genesis by name. This is something of a continuity point, but in the previous film, Kirk has to go through a whole security procedure to even show the Genesis presentation to Spock and McCoy, neither of whom has heard of it before. So how is it that Genesis has become a galactic controversy to the point that even the goofy alien McCoy meets in the bar knows there is a planet called Genesis? And why does McCoy even assume that he knows that name? Okay, he's slightly cuckoo here, but really. Sure, it's reasonable to think a nebula erasing kaboom would be spotted by both friends and foe, but did the Federation just shrug and admit what it was, right down to releasing its name? Did someone working at Starfleet or for the Federation leak it? Did Carol Marcus give a press conference? It's either a secret or it's not. Make up your mind, movie. Number 3, the only ship in the quadrant, RE-REDUX. Just how dumb is it that the Enterprise is always the only ship around and about? In the motion picture, the Enterprise is the only starship in interception range of the oncoming V'ger cloud. In The Wrath of Khan, while on a training cruise, she's the only ship in the quadrant. In The Search for Spock, she's apparently still the only ship in the quadrant because nothing stands between her and the Genesis planet, except the Scout-class USS Grissom in orbit of said planet. Genesis is a known galactic controversy, and Starfleet hasn't positioned a single top-of-the-line ship in a position where it could rush in to provide assistance to the Grissom, stop potential enemy incursions, or thwart rule-breaking admirals named Kirk. Just how few ships does Starfleet have in this era anyway? Number 2, Spock's escape hatch. Can we all just admit that nothing about Spock's physical resurrection makes sense? The Genesis effect caused the microbes on the funeral torpedo tube to hyper-evolve from microscopic organisms to Klingon-choking worms. But in Spock's case, it did what? Rebooted him as an embryo? A newborn? A mindless infant who somehow had the sense to learn to walk without crawling out of an adult-sized funeral robe? So why did Genesis Control-Alt-Delete Spock instead of mutating him like the microbes? And just how did this mindless reanimated Spock manage to get out of a tube which can somehow survive an atmospheric re-entry without popping open? Or is there a convenient handle inside for the deceased to operate? If not, it seems like Spock would have been reanimated and just suffocate and or die of hunger and thirst in this sealed casket. And speaking of hunger and thirst, Number 1. The Genesis Defect Redux. As in The Dumbest Things in Star Trek II Wrath of Khan, in Star Trek III, Genesis remains thick-cut baloney all around. And, as in previous entries in this list, it does all sorts of preposterous things. But amongst its million household uses, it can somehow also provide ongoing sustenance to life forms that it animates. What were those fast-evolving microbes consuming in order to allow their incredible growth? And what about Spock? We never see him eating anything, so just what nutrients are fueling his violent growth spurs and his growing pains as he pulls an American Werewolf in London to go from teen to Leonard Nimoy? And isn't it convenient that they beam up and the Genesis planet explodes exactly when rapid-aging Spock just happens to look how he would've if he had lived 2 more summers past his irradiation date? The real answer is one sadly common on Star Trek, but pushed to the limits in some of the movies, and especially by Genesis. The science part of the science fiction is mostly no such thing. It's pseudoscientific sounding claptrap, which is essentially magic. The all-purpose Genesis effect is about as scientific as David Marcus waving a wand at Spock's coffin and reciting an incantation. In reality, such growth would require the former microbes and Spock be constantly eating and defecating, so perhaps we should be grateful that the producers went for the dumb magic science instead. And with that, those were 10 of the dumbest things in Star Trek III, The Search for Spock. This list, like the others, is an adaptation from our articles with 4 additional dumb things listed there. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up. And if you like what we do here at TrekCulture, make sure that you hit that subscribe button so you never miss an upload. If you want to keep up with us outside of YouTube, you can do so by finding us on Twitter at TrekCulture and on Instagram at TrekCultureYT. You can also find me on various social medias by searching TREKI.